couple of you? Yeah. Including our camera. All right. So what the idea of this is to kind of give you ideas in case you ever have to do a particular speech. Not necessarily for this semester, but even going forward. Because one of the biggest problems we always run into when we're teaching classes is people keep coming up to us and saying, I have no idea, where I'm going to get an idea for a speech. And so we give them the list. Everybody's seen the workbook that we hand out. And so we get the same speeches every semester over and over again because there's probably 3 or 4 on that list that are kind of worth doing. And the rest of them are people look at that and go, not something I would ever want to do in a million years. And so you may notice this in your classes. You'll see people doing the same kind of speech over and over again because people keep using that same list and doing the same kind of speeches. So this is kind of an idea to give you a better opportunity to find better kinds of speeches that you could actually do or topics to do. It's also useful if you're writing papers and trying to figure out what to write a paper on. Because you run into that same problem where you're always looking for, what can my topic be about, and you keep going back to the same well of the same things over and over again, and then keep literally writing the same speech over and over again. I knew one guy that constantly wrote the same speech all throughout his entire college career, and it was pretty sad actually to read it. Can't tell you how many times. And then he actually took a public speaking class and gave the same speech that he was writing all his papers on. So you get that kind of thing going on. So, should kind of figure out where the logistics of this work out. So there's different kinds of speeches you'll actually end up doing. You may or may not end up doing them in the speech classes you have here, or if you do, don't be surprised when you come across them. The first one that I've written on the list is called impromptu. Has anybody ever heard of this term before? Yes, no?
Yes.
Kind of need feedback. I'm one of those people that if I don't hear back from people, I think you're not paying attention to me, and then I start crying. It gets to be a really sad class, because then all the rest of you start crying, and then we just start crying together, and it's really a sad class. I've had one of those once before, and it was just very uncomfortable. So impromptu is basically you have no idea what you're going to be speaking about before you speak. Somebody gives you a topic right at that particular moment, and you've got quite often about 2 minutes to prepare an actual speech. Sounds like fun, right? And then you do for 4 or 5 minutes of a speech and then deliver on what you've just been given. Has anybody ever done one of those before? Not a single person in here? Oh, you have. How was it?
Scary.
So not fun? Fun wasn't the word you were going for? Okay. It can be fun if you kind of know what you're actually doing before you get into it, but quite often it's sprung on you at the last minute, and you kind of learn standing there, and it turns out to be a horrible experience for most people. So keep in mind that is a kind of speech where you do have to come up with an idea, but your ideas will come from whatever a central idea is. Informatives and persuasives are something you're probably going to end up doing here if you're taking any one of your speech classes. Is anybody here taking speech? Have you done an informative or a persuasive? Or you're planning to do an informative or persuasive? So these are the ones that people find the hardest on actually getting a topic. And so we'll talk a little more about how you would actually get it going forward. So where do you find ideas? What I often tell people is you know far more information than people realize you actually do, or more than you realize you actually do. Because all of you have lived at least a couple of years, right? Is that true? Is anybody here not at least 2 years old? So you've had lots of experiences. You've had experiences that nobody else has ever actually had, which means you can draw on so much information that you don't even realize you can draw upon. And one thing we used to do as a little test for a lot of classes we did is we'd have people keep not a diary, but kind of like this is my past recollections of stuff I've actually done over the years. And as they start the list, they have just a couple of things on it. And then as the semester goes on, they would just keep adding things to it. By the end of the semester, they'd have a book length of things they've done their entire life, but didn't remember any of that until they literally sat down and thought about it. Or they were doing something else and then suddenly it dawned on the part of the expectation was you'd have the book around with you all the time. So like if you're just thinking about something in the middle of the day and going, oh, wait a minute, I remember when I did this. So you write that particular thing down. And those lists would get longer and longer. Those are the kinds of things you can draw upon if you're looking for some kind of topic that you want to cover. And quite often, instead of the, okay, here's a list of 20 things, pick from one of those and here's your topic, which is not the most fun to actually do, but you know certain things and therefore you're interested in certain things, so therefore your topic can be something that you're more interested in rather than something you're being given and told to give a speech about. Does that make sense? You know how that works? So that's what you already know. Idea list, that's the thing that you get in the public speaking book. You know, here's a whole bunch of things you can actually use for your speeches. And I personally hate those because as a public speaking teacher, I see the same speech over and over again. I can't tell you how many times I've seen speeches about dogs. Love dogs, but that's the kind of same speech you get over and over again. There's a couple of them on there that for some reason they've never used. Like there's a Japanese fighting dog. That's one of the listed things. I've never seen a speech on that. They always choose the easier ones. That's how those kind of lists go. Your friends, you can ask them information, you know, ask them what kinds of things do you find interesting, that sort of thing. You can get ideas from them. Conversations with people, that's kind of the same thing with friends. And things that interest you, and that's what I was talking about before. You've got your entire life to draw on, things that you find interesting. I was talking to a person earlier today that's into computer games. So chances are pretty good he could actually write a speech about computer games, you know, based on the fact that he's interested in it. But do keep in mind, just because you're interested in something doesn't make you an expert on that particular topic. So what would you need to do in order to become an expert on that particular topic?
Research.
Research? What else? What makes you an expert on a topic?
You've actually written articles about it?
You've written articles about it, okay. Like professional ones?
Well,
Or?
yeah, like a fishing article or something.
Okay, or if you did one in another class before or something like that. So that would make you more knowledgeable about the topic itself. So you can draw upon those types of experiences. If you're well read on a particular subject, I can't tell you how many topics I've actually seen from people who actually have never done anything on that topic before and give what's basically what I like to call the generic speech, which means they've done just as much research as I did while sitting at the computer looking at the exact same topic they were. Which means, well, let me ask you this. If I gave you somebody give me a subject that you probably think I don't know anything about.
Calisthenics.
Calisthenics. Yeah, that's probably one I don't know much about. And so if I was to go and research for the next 15 minutes and then come back and give you a speech on calisthenics, would you find that really fascinating and interesting? What do you think? Probably not, right? Because what's it missing?
Credibility.
Credibility, because I'm not really an expert on calisthenics. You kind of noticed that just by looking at me. What else? What else would be a problem with the speech?
Wasn't well researched.
Yeah, I spent, 15 minutes getting information on it? So I probably know just as much as anybody else who just looked up the topic for the very first time. So somebody that's actually into calisthenics, and this happens all the time, not just with calisthenics, with any subject, if there's somebody that's more interested in that subject than the person who's actually delivering the subject, they're going to know more about it than the person giving the speech. And that gets to be a really frustrating experience because, believe it or not, I'm actually knowledgeable over far more things than I probably should be. And people don't know that. They start giving speeches and I'm sitting there going, all of this is wrong. This is badly researched. And I'm just sitting there going, I want to judge you on how well you did your speech, not on how bad your information is. You know, because my job is not to be a content, supervisor, but to be, a objective listener of speeches. And so that happens quite often. It happens also, because I also judge speech and debate. And debate is my favorite thing to judge because people will walk up in front of you convinced they know far more over any subject than you could possibly imagine. And somebody will get into political theory. You know, I won't mention I have a PhD in political science, and they'll go off on political theory and just kind of like, you know, I'm an expert on this, and I'm like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. And so, what causes that kind of attitude? Why do people do that? There's assumptions being made, right? So what are those assumptions? You want to guess?
They think they know.
They think they know, and they make an assumption on your audience. Because remember, one of the things you're going to be doing every time you give a speech, no matter, even every time you write a paper, as a matter of fact, you're going to be doing what's called an audience analysis. You need to make sure you understand a little bit about your audience before you actually start giving your speech, or you may find your audience knows far more about your speech than you realize. Or they may just completely disagree with you. And so those are some of the things you want to keep in mind. So a long time ago, way too long ago, as I often mention in my classes, back when dinosaurs were still wandering around, okay? That's when I was young. And so I got out of the service and decided that I was just gonna sit around one day and watch television. Now, how many people here are familiar with something called TED Talks? Quite a few of you, right? People who didn't raise your hand, you're not familiar with them, or you are? Okay. TED Talks are, somebody want to tell me what a TED Talk is? That knows what it is? Yeah, it's basically experts in a particular field give speeches on topics that most people don't even realize they're actually interested in. And by the time you're done with one of these TED Talk speeches, you're really fascinated by all of this information that you never knew before. And then suddenly you're kind of like a semi-expert on the same information. A lot of people do a lot of research based off of what that is. Well, TED Talks only started recently. And originally they were called the Berkeley Speech Series. And so UC Berkeley used to give these speeches, and it's kind of like where TED Talks came from. And so they would call these people in, and they would talk about different things, or they would argue about different things. And it would cause people to start thinking and start all sorts of different research they never intended to do before. And so, give you an example. I think that's right now. Yeah, the early TED Talks. So, one of the first ones I was actually watching included this individual here. Anybody know who this guy is? You look familiar to anybody? He's actually really, really famous. You just don't know it because you don't recognize the name. Even if I gave you his name, you probably still couldn't tell me who he is. His name is G. Gordon Liddy.
You hear his voice though, he's got a very unique voice.
So, I'm assuming you know who he is, right? Okay, so aside from you, anybody tell me who he is? Or why he would be famous? Can you tell me why he's famous?
I don't really remember. It had something to do with the military though, I think. I'm not sure.
Kind of. He's actually the guy who was instrumental in causing Watergate to happen. He's the guy who orchestrated the whole thing. So when they were looking for the bad guy, this was the guy they actually went after. Everybody knows what Watergate is, right? Yes? No? It's when the Republican Party decided to, during the Nixon administration, decided to bug the Democratic Party. Anybody remember this? And our president was basically thrown out of office. That whole thing. Anyway, so this is the guy that actually hired all the people to go out and bug the other side. So, very right-wing commentator. This guy, anybody ever seen this guy before? Does he look like a right? Come back! I just learned, do not ever touch this screen. Really? There we go. So, watch as I don't touch this screen this time. Okay, so the guy on the bottom here, Okay, has anybody ever seen him before? Or does he look like a right-wing commentator like Gordon Liddy is? No, probably not, right? He's probably looking the opposite. That's exactly what he was. His name is Timothy Leary. And if you know anything about Timothy Leary, he was actually in charge of the LSD movement. Anybody knows what LSD is? Yes? You may not know what LSD is. If you don't, that would actually be a really good thing. It's a really bad drug that was being experimented on back in the 60s into the 70s. So anyway, he was the leader of that movement. So the two of them decided they were going to actually have conversations with each other, and they did it all over the country, and then it kind of ended up at Berkeley where they started doing it all the time. This was the early TED Talks. And they would argue over everything. Because the one thing that was really interesting about both of them is they're both brilliant. And that's, people often on one side or the other thinking the other side is not brilliant, you know, the other side is stupid, you know, that kind of thing. And so they had some really brilliant conversations. And so what they would do, and the reason I'm mentioning them here, is they would look at things from a completely different perspective. And so they would look at the same subject everybody else has, and then show, hey, here's something you haven't thought about before, and start covering it that way. This person was Lydia and Larry. Helen Caldecott, you may or may not know who she is. Remember the story I was telling you where I used to sit around late at night and watch the early TED Talks of Berkeley? Well, one night I was sitting there watching, this woman comes on the screen, her name is Helen Caldecott, this person right here. She comes on the screen and she's talking about something I completely disagreed with. I mean, everything she said was just the opposite of what my political philosophy was. And so, if you're watching that, what do you generally think your reaction is going to be?
You're gonna get mad?
Going to get mad? What else?
Not going to listen very well.
Not going to listen really well. You're just going to be sitting there going, you know, heckling at the TV, that kind of thing.
Or you can change the channel.
You would have if you were less lazy than I was at that particular moment. So I was actually sitting there watching it going, I really should get up and turn the channel. Didn't have a remote back then. So I'm like, but it's too far to go. So I'm just going to sit here and watch this and see what happens. So 15 minutes into this demonstration, her whole speech was, if you want to save this planet, this is how you do it. And so I'm sitting there going, yeah, whatever. And so about 15 minutes into it, I'm thinking, okay, I'll give you that one. That was a good point, okay? But that's all I'm giving you, because you're obviously not so. And about another 15 minutes, this was a 4-hour presentation they did, so that just shows how bored I actually was on that particular day. And so about another 15 minutes into it, I'm like, okay, that's pretty good too, okay? I'm kind of getting the idea on that. And so I'd say about 2 hours into this thing, I'm like on her side, convinced this person really knows what she's talking about, and this is a perspective I've never heard before. And she did it in a really interesting way. I almost wanted to touch the screen again. So, perspectives. One of the first things she was talking about, is anybody familiar with this picture? Anybody not familiar with it? It's okay if you're not.
No.
Okay. Anybody ever heard of Tiananmen Square? It's Chinese were cracking down on protesters. And so this guy, can't tell if you can see it or not, this guy right here, I won't touch it because that will kill my demonstration. This guy right here decided to stop in front of the tanks and keep them from breaking up the entire protest that was going on. And so this became kind of a rallying cry for democracy and all this kind of stuff. It's one of the most famous scenes you'll ever see throughout history. And so she showed me a completely different picture of this during her demonstration. And what she did, and I'd never actually seen this before, is she took this picture and pulled it back and showed what else was actually going on in the same exact scene. Because all the media showed us this. So this is all you ever saw. And so when you turn back, or went back, there's picnic tables over here, there's people dancing and everything over here. It's a completely different scene than what you're actually seeing in this one little photograph moment. Does everybody see how that's a completely different perspective? And so somebody decided to give us this perspective, and therefore that's all we were going to get. And so when I got this different perspective, I started thinking maybe there was something that I didn't know before. So this one, has anybody seen this picture before? Few people have seen it. This takes place in Saigon. Everybody know where Saigon is? Vietnam. So right before the Vietnam War, the police chief of the South Vietnamese executes a prisoner pretty much on camera. And it becomes kind of one of the rallying cries, kind of like the same thing over here. It becomes a huge political moment. The thing that was interesting about this that I didn't know at the time is this is not a photograph. This is actually part of a newsreel. So there's much more to this scene than you're seeing here. And what she did is she showed the entire scene. And it takes this whole moment completely out of perspective. And it's a much different perspective to it. If you ever get a chance to take a look at it, you should. I'm not going to give you what happened because it's one of those things you probably should go and look at. But the idea was that she was telling me was, everything you're seeing, you may be seeing it from a different lens than you actually realize. When you're putting together speeches, quite often you can deal with the exact same speech that somebody else is doing, and then just take a small little perspective that nobody else has actually ever thought about. Does that make sense? People don't generally do that. They keep talking about the same thing over and over again, and they do it in the same way that it's always been packaged for us. So that may be an interesting way to actually deal with subjects that you never dealt with before. Does that make sense? Kind of how it works? All right. So this is kind of one of my axioms I got when I was actually going to school a long time ago, and I was in a communication class. My first communication class when I was undergraduate, I had this idea for doing what's called a communication analysis. Has anybody ever heard of one of these before? Basically, you take an incident that happens and you run it through a communication theory to explain how the message that you're being told means something completely different than you actually understand. And that's kind of how the whole process works. And so I had heard of this theory called Borman's fantasy theory, where you can literally, doesn't matter what it is. Anyway, so Borman's fantasy theory was this great idea I had, and I thought, now all I need to do is find a situation where that makes sense. You know, and I can use that to apply to it. So I was telling this to one of my teachers, and his line was, be a nail, not a hammer. And I didn't understand what he meant at the time. And what he meant was, I had this great theory, and I'm now trying to run around and find some place to hammer it in. And so I'm a hammer in search of nails, as opposed to being the nail that needs to be hammered. So having an actual incident, and then a theory to back it up. Does that make sense, kind of how that works? So the idea is you want to make sure when you're putting together your ideas for your speeches or for your papers or whatever it is, start with the idea first, and then look for whatever way you want to explain it. So if you're doing a persuasive, and you need a problem, cause, solution, because you all heard that before, right? So you start off with your problem, and that's what being the nail is. You start off with your problem, and then you try to solve it. The problem runs into is if you go the other direction. Because you've got an agency that's doing something, you're very limited by what you can actually talk about as a problem. So I'll give you an example. The American Cancer Society, what do they deal with? Cancer, right? So if I wanted to solve world hunger, would I go to the World Cancer Society? No. So if I've chose my agency, my World Cancer Society, I'm very limited in what I can talk about. Whereas if I wanted to do a speech on world hunger, am I limited by what types of agencies I need to go to? No, but I just got to find one that actually deals with world hunger. Do you see the difference between the two? If you start with the agency, which a lot of people do, and I keep telling people to stop doing that, you have a very hard time actually coming up with your problem. Or you're very limited to whatever they're dealing with. Does that make sense? So that's kind of like the nail, not a hammer kind of thing. All right. So, and this is probably the most important thing, it's narrowing down your topic. Because people will start off with, I'm going to talk about, here, somebody give me a topic.
Motorcycle safety.
Motorcycle safety? Okay, so if my topic is motorcycle safety, how limited is that? Or let me put that in a better way. How hard is it to actually give a speech on motorcycle safety? If I wanted to do one right now, how easy would that be? Say I had all the background information on it. What's hard about it?
There's too many different.
Yeah, there's
Helmets.
tons of different things I could cover. So if I wanted to go with motorcycle safety, how about if I went with helmets? Okay, I think everyone should, I'm not saying I care, if I cared about it, I do care about it, let me rephrase that. If it was an issue that was important to me, there we go. And I wanted people to do something about it, I might actually deal with it from the helmet perspective, you know, or training, or something to that effect. If it was just motorcycle safety, you see how that's more general? It's going to be really hard to nail down what you're actually talking about. And people do that all the time. So they'll give a speech on, I want to give my speech on AIDS. And you're like, okay, what about it? Well, it's bad. And so you spend the next 15 minutes trying to explain to them that yes, it's bad, something needs to be done about it, but you need to be much more specific in the way you're actually dealing with it. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the lesson on that. So give you an example. Let's do a speech on birds. Okay, so we're all going to do this big speech on birds, right? Is that specific enough? No, because there's probably all sorts of birds, right? So let's narrow it down a bit. We're going to talk about, well, that's birds. We're going to talk about penguins. Penguins are birds, right? Is that narrow enough? Probably not, right? So here's a penguin. There's a couple of penguins. How about emperor penguins? Is that a little more specific? So I've narrowed it down to the point of where it's important. There's my emperor penguins. And so once I've done that, I want to go out and do research. Don't try to do your research before you've narrowed it down. That's the point of that. So I do my research, I get all my evidence, and then I start putting together my speech. And a very easy way to do it, just based on that, is history of emperor penguins, you know, in the media or however I'm going to deal with it. Then I could cover maybe their lifestyle. And then something that interesting that I picked up when I was actually studying it, that's something that other people aren't aware of, and go, hey, this would be really fascinating for people to know, and that would be my third point. See how that kind of gets put together? Yes, no? So that's the basic idea of how to do that. A couple of tips and variations, because we always tell you to put this on your speeches. I'm just following the format that we keep teaching everybody else about how to do. Don't worry if someone has the same topic. I get this question all the time. What if I do the same speech somebody else is doing? You're not doing the same speech someone else is going to do. If you're doing the exact same speech somebody else is doing, what's the problem? Plagiarism. You stole somebody else's speech. Because you should be writing your own speech, so your speech is always going to be different from somebody else's. So never worry if you're doing the same speech. Remember, you're here to inform or to persuade based on whatever your speech is. So if my speech's goal is to inform, don't try to persuade anybody of anything. If I'm here to tell you about emperor penguins, I don't need to tell you to save them. If my job is to tell you to save emperor penguins, just telling you about them is not all that necessary. I might cover it, but that's not my important part of the step. Does that make sense? And the last one should be self-explanatory, but this is the one people fail at the most. The more you practice before you give your speech, the better you're going to do. I tell people this all the time, and it falls on deaf ears every time I say it. If you practice your speech a whole bunch of times, and the first time you give it is not in front of me for the first time, you'll do really well. If the very first time you've done your speech is in class for me that first time, chances are it's not going to be that great. Does that make sense? And by the way, if you ever do want to practice a speech or anything, or film it, we do it here and we don't charge you anything to do it. That's what these rooms over here are for. And so you can literally record it. We have all the equipment and everything, so just to let you know. Okay, that's really all I have. Any questions? Do you feel informed in any way? Wasn't a persuasion. I wasn't trying to tell you to do anything, except at the very end there. Any questions on anything? That's all we got. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.